To tell the story of civil rights in the United States is to tell the story of mass suffering. Suffering that was caused by hate, bigotry, and a system that was fundamentally built to slow progress. While there are countless people that worked extremely hard and even gave their lives for the cause of equality, this video will focus primarily on one man and his role in ensuring equal rights for Americans of every color. Lyndon Johnson was not perfect. He was an incredibly flawed man who, despite his passage of civil rights, did convey on numerous occasions his own personal racism. This video focuses on Lyndon Johnson not because he is the perfect champion of civil rights, but instead because he is the president who was able to get it done. A poor man's son, born and raised in one of the most forgotten parts of the country, who managed to accomplish what no president before him could. I'm fascinated by Lyndon Johnson not because I love everything that he did, but because of his unique political talent and the contradictions in his character. This is my second video about LBJ based on Robert Caro's incredible book series, The Years of Lyndon Johnson. I have all 4 volumes right here, and as you can see, they're pretty hefty. I was very intimidated by the idea of reading these, but I can confidently say now that it's honestly my favorite book series. It's one that made me look at history and politics in a whole new light, and honestly, it's changed my life. I don't know if I would be making the same kind of videos that I am on this channel without it. This video won't be looking at LBJ's civil rights legislation. There's plenty of great videos and documentaries about that already. Instead, I wanted to take a look at why civil rights was so difficult to achieve and why it took Lyndon Johnson to do it. Despite the Civil War ending nearly a century prior to Lyndon Johnson's time in office, Black Americans were still denied the basic rights of American citizenship. While the American South and its 11 former Confederate states had the immense power necessary to maintain segregation, there's one thing that they couldn't do: elect a president. The northern states were heavily populated and carried much more power in choosing the Democratic presidential nominee. In the 100 years between the administrations of Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Baines Johnson, not a single Southerner had been elected to the presidency. No matter how powerful and charismatic a Southern leader was, the fact that they were Southern was enough to hold them back from the nation's highest honor. Legendary Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn was at one point gifted a plaque that read, "To our beloved Sam Rayburn, who would have been president if he had come from any place but the South." In walks Lyndon Johnson, a true creature of Washington. The larger-than-life Texas politician was one of the most ambitious, power-hungry people that Washington had ever seen, and that says a lot. It was the South that would raise Lyndon Johnson to the heights of political power, and it was at the hands of Lyndon Johnson that the South would suffer its greatest defeat in 100 years. To the Southern Democrats that brought him to power, Lyndon Johnson would become a Judas, one of their own who broke ranks and betrayed them. While Johnson had initially been elected to Congress as a New Deal Democrat who cozied up to FDR, he was ideologically inconsistent and would outright lie to those around him in order to appear in agreement with them. Johnson even caught the admiration of old Speaker Rayburn, who was a notoriously grumpy man. The short, angry Rayburn was an intimidating figure to almost everyone in Washington. Because of this, many people were shocked when they saw LBJ come up and kiss the speaker on his big bald head. As long as you were in a position to help Lyndon Johnson, he would suck up to you better than anybody else. LBJ is often described as a professional son with a unique talent for making older men and women grow fond of him. This was particularly useful for Johnson's career in Congress, as Congress was an old man's game. Leadership roles in the House and Senate weren't given based off of merit, they were given based off of seniority. If you wanted to be the chairman of a committee, your best bet was to join that committee and then do your best to outlive and outlast everyone else there until it was your turn. This wasn't good enough for the ambitious Johnson, who did not expect to live very long. There was a saying in the Johnson family that Johnson men don't live past 60, and for the most part that's proven itself to be true. Even with millions of dollars and healthcare fit for a president, Johnson himself wouldn't live past 64. This fear of death lit a fire under Johnson, which meant he would not be able to take the traditional path to power that was laid out for him. The House of Representatives was beholden to the passions of the electorate. The Senate was actually made for the opposite purpose. The United States Senate was created as a force of moderation, a steady hand that would prevent the country from moving too fast in any direction. While members of the House are up for re-election every 2 years, members of the Senate are only re-elected every 6. Lyndon Johnson arrived in the upper chamber of Congress in 1949, just a young man in his 40s with no seniority whatsoever. What Johnson did have was the ability to kiss up to older men, an ability that would take him to the heights of political power faster than almost anyone else. Richard Brevard Russell was the United States Senator from Georgia and the most powerful figure in the Senate. Russell was an old-school Southern gentleman. He believed in preserving the Southern way of life the way that he saw it, which of course meant preserving segregation.
The legend of the antebellum South. Elegant Neo-Grecian mansions. Coquettish belles under the magnolias. Dancing with young men, gallant and reckless, ready to duel for a lady's honor. The kindly master ruling his kingdom with justice and humanity, and served by his faithful, contented lackeys.
Russell wasn't as outwardly racist as many of his fellow Southern senators, such as Strom Thurmond. He believed in being a true gentleman, which basically meant coding his racist beliefs under a veneer of respectability. He felt that doing things like constantly spouting out the N-word made the South look backwards and prejudiced. Another important fact about Russell is that he was an unmarried man with no children, a man of great responsibility but no immediate family to call his own. This is something he had in common with the aforementioned Sam Rayburn. Another thing these two Southern leaders had in common was their affinity for professional son, Lyndon Johnson. An affinity that was no coincidence. You don't just go around and make two of the most powerful men in Washington your father figures on accident.
Overlooking the city of Washington is the legislative center of American life, the U.S. Capitol. As our country faces important challenges at home and abroad, the new 82nd Congress convenes. Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas is Senate Whip.
Back then, the Senate worked differently from how we understand it today. The majority leader wasn't nearly as powerful and thus was a less desirable position. Despite his total lack of seniority, Russell's love for Johnson allowed him to become the Assistant Democratic Leader, or Minority Whip, in 1951, just 3 years after he first entered the chamber. This was completely unprecedented, but then again, so was Johnson's ambition. He would become Minority Leader in 1953 and Majority Leader in 1954. Not only was Johnson Majority Leader during his first term, he was the youngest Majority Leader in American history. I just want to reiterate how insane that is. All of Congress had been built on seniority, and in just a couple of years, Lyndon Johnson threw that out the window. In the coming years, Lyndon Johnson would bend the most stubborn institution in all of American politics to his will. He became the master of the Senate. Richard Russell hated the fact that no Southerner had been elected president in nearly a century. While the South held strength in the Senate, Russell felt they had never been fully redeemed in the eyes of the country as a whole. He felt that it would take a president from his beloved Southland to heal that great wound. Russell himself would try for the office, but to no avail. The old Southerner recognized the sheer political talent of his protege and felt he could be the one to finally make it across the finish line. But for a Southern Democrat to win the presidency, it was going to take an extraordinary effort. To achieve his dream, Russell was willing to bend the rules of the Senate, which he had guarded so diligently. His love for Johnson, combined with the commitment to electing a Southern president, would open the floodgates of Johnson's political power. The Senate was built on seniority. If you wanted a chairmanship, you were going to have to wait. Your qualifications or expertise didn't matter. All that mattered was how long you had been there. Because of this, the Senate was a slow-moving machine, but that was about to change. Johnson was majority leader, and he had his eyes on the presidency. In order to reach that goal, he was going to need an incredible record. Johnson went to Russell with an idea. What if Johnson could assign committee seats and chairmanships as he pleased? That way, the Senate could move at a more productive pace and Johnson could build more of a reputation for himself. Russell allowed it, and suddenly everything changed. The Senate was suddenly moving more than ever, and doing so at Johnson's command. This man was clearly a leader of men. The 1950s were an extremely tense time in American history, which saw anger against Southern injustice. While they still controlled the levers of power, the South's ability to overcome the obstacles was starting to appear thin. While they could control legislation, they needed a Southerner in the White House to solidify their place. The problem is that the Democratic National Convention was never going to choose a Southern Democrat as their nominee, not as long as civil rights was hanging in the background. In an effort to make Johnson more palatable to the Northern Democrats, Russell and his fellow Southerners would allow LBJ to go forward with a Civil Rights Act, albeit a toothless one. But the passage of this law, however symbolic, would soon open the floodgates for all the landmark legislation that we associate with Lyndon Johnson today.
Now, I have tried to do that by implementing the constitutional rights guaranteed to every citizen with 2 civil rights bills during the 3 Congresses that I have been leader.
Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy all tried to address the question of civil rights during their presidencies, but they mostly failed. Passing the Civil Rights Act took Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had never supported civil rights in his entire career, a man who owed so much of his political success to the very people he would now be fighting. Lately, I've gotten a lot of really nice comments talking about how fair and unbiased my videos are, and while I appreciate that, the truth is that no one can ever truly be unbiased. But that's why I use this video sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that combines news from around the world in one place so you can compare coverage. For every news source, you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable the reporting is, and who owns them. They even have a blind spot feed that highlights news that is being disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. It's so easy to get stuck inside of your own political bubble, and Ground News helps you get information from thousands of sources worldwide in one place. It lets you get news from diverse perspectives and from sources that you otherwise would have missed. You can use code Andre Dutra to get 15% off your subscription, and any purchase that you make directly goes to help out the channel. Thank you again to Ground News for sponsoring the video. Johnson consistently voted against every civil rights measure he came across. He had opposed an anti-lynching bill, military integration, and ending the poll tax. He went as far as to call Harry Truman's civil rights program a police state. Johnson was willing to take whatever position necessary to get power. Whatever compassion he had was outweighed by ambition. What could possibly make this shrewd, calculating politician put all of his political capital into passing civil rights? Lyndon Johnson grew up in the hill country of Texas. His dad had been an honest politician who fell on hard times because he didn't participate in the political corruption so common in that era. It was common in the South for black people to do the most physically demanding manual labor jobs. There weren't many black people in the hill country, however, so the kind of grueling work that would usually fall on them instead ending up going to the poorest white people. One of these people was a young Lyndon Johnson. From the ages of 17 to 18, young LBJ worked on a road gang building a highway from the hill country to Austin in the hot Texas sun.
To begin with, workmen set up a heavy steel track along each side of the road. Now the roadway has become a highway. Highways that let us travel quickly and safely, if we're careful, wherever we want to go.
This was back-breaking work for the tall, slender Johnson who detested exercise. It's possible that this experience and the ridicule Johnson suffered due to his poverty gave him a greater compassion for the downtrodden, the poor people and racial minorities in society that had been the victims of circumstance. At every turn in his life, LBJ chose ambition. He followed whatever road he could on his path to power, no matter how narrow it was. Johnson's parents had been idealists that went out of their way to help others, but after their fall from grace, they became the laughingstock of their small town. LBJ decided he needed to appear cold, calculating, and shrewd in order to not end up destitute like his parents did. Robert Caro writes, he always had this true, deep compassion to help poor people, and particularly poor people of color. But even stronger than the compassion was his ambition. But when the two aligned, when compassion and ambition finally are pointing in the same direction, Lyndon Johnson became a force for racial justice unequaled, certainly since Lincoln. During college, Johnson took up a teaching job to be able to pay for his classes. He taught at a Mexican school in the small town of Cotulla, Texas. Lyndon Johnson knew poverty, but he had never seen anything as bad as this. Teachers came and went, but no one had ever really cared for these children, taken the extra step to make sure they got a quality education. The thing about Lyndon Johnson is that he could never do anything halfway. He always had to be the best. He had to stand out. He had to be a leader. Johnson took this job very seriously and was putting in extra hours to make sure the kids were getting a better education. This school didn't even have a ball for the kids to play with, but LBJ made sure they got one. The school janitor, Thomas Coronado, didn't even speak English, but Johnson was on a mission to make sure he did. So 20-year-old Lyndon Johnson starts meeting up with Coronado before and after every school day to give him English lessons. While working on civil rights legislation, Johnson would often reminisce and tell stories about teaching these school children.
My first job after college was as a teacher in Cotulla, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. Few of them could speak English, and I couldn't speak much Spanish. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast, hungry. And they knew, even in their youth, the pain of prejudice. They never seemed to know why people disliked them, but they knew it was so, because I saw it in their eyes. I often walked home late in the afternoon after the classes were finished, wishing there was more that I could do. But all I knew was to teach them the little that I knew, hoping that it might help them against the hardships that lay ahead. And somehow you never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the hopeful face of a young child. I never thought then, in 1928, that I would be standing here in 1965. It never even occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students and to help people like them all over this country. But now I do have that chance. And I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it.
Lyndon Johnson's talent as a politician is multifaceted, but if I could sum it up with one word, it would be salesman. A friend of Johnson's once described him as the greatest salesman one-on-one that ever lived. In a conversation with just one other person, Johnson could convince anyone of anything. Now it was time for the Great Salesman to make his hardest sale of all, civil rights. Part of why Johnson's salesman accolade comes with the caveat one-on-one instead of just greatest salesman of all time is because frankly, Johnson was a big fat liar. Johnson would lie so blatantly and so often that in college he was known as Bullshit Johnson. But the thing about LBJ is he would get into these moods where he would work himself up not just to lie, but to believe that lie completely. Not only could Lyndon Johnson convince anyone of anything, he could convince himself of anything. And he needed to do that in order to fully dedicate himself to a cause. He badgered and he bullied all of his fellow lawmakers until they fell into agreement with him. In my research for this project, I came across a video of Senator Richard Russell, which really helps illustrate the Southern backlash to the new civil rights legislation at the time.
I greatly fear that the Vice President of the United States, who has recently been in conference with some of the leaders supporting this legislation, will join with them to wipe out any semblance of regular parliamentary procedure in the effort to cram this bill down our throats. I have stated on the floor of the Senate this afternoon that it seems that a legislative lynching of a minority is in prospect.
I kid you not, my jaw literally dropped when I saw that. The idea of this segregationist senator using the language of lynching a minority, with the minority being the Southern segregationists, is baffling. One of LBJ's trademarks was his famous Johnson treatment, where Johnson would get up into somebody's personal space and physically intimidate them with his large size. It's often talked about with this famous photo, but you might not know that this is actually LBJ's father figure and mentor, Richard Russell himself. In 1960, Lyndon Johnson made his first campaign for the presidency, but ultimately lost the Democratic primary to the younger John F. Kennedy. Johnson resented Kennedy as the privileged son of a rich man, an upbringing very different from his own. LBJ saw JFK as a lazy freshman senator who never showed up to work, let alone got anything done in the Senate that Johnson ran so efficiently. In Johnson's eyes, Kennedy was a lightweight who LBJ would dominate as he had done to many others. While campaigning against him for the nomination, Johnson tried to inform the press that Kennedy had Addison's disease, but what Johnson wasn't aware of was the extent of Kennedy's physical pain. If LBJ had known the resilience and sheer force of will that it took for Kennedy to conduct his daily life while maintaining the facade of a young, energetic leader, perhaps he would have seen Kennedy as a more credible opponent. Johnson would of course lose the nomination and join Kennedy's ticket as VP. I was actually able to get my hands on these two Kennedy-Johnson campaign buttons, which are very cool. They're quite small, but I think they look nice.
It started in July when the Democratic Party nominated Senator John F. Kennedy for President of the United States, and for Vice President, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. The party united behind its candidates.
Vice President Thomas R. Marshall famously said, "Once there were two brothers. One ran away to sea, the other was elected Vice President of the United States, and nothing was heard from either of them again." Why would LBJ, who'd fought and clawed his way up the political ladder to become the most powerful majority leader in American history, give up his role for the powerlessness and embarrassment of the vice presidency? Power is where power goes. These are words that Johnson lived by. Throughout his life, Johnson had occupied positions of little importance that he managed to mold into those of significant power through sheer political talent. So why would the vice presidency be any different? Johnson sought to maintain his hold over the Senate while vice president, a clear violation of the separation of powers. JFK, of course, wasn't going to let that happen. LBJ didn't think that much of Jack Kennedy and thought he would be fairly easy to control, but he thought wrong. Johnson's expertise and legislative ability would have been a gift for the Kennedy White House, which struggled greatly with Congress. To Johnson's frustration, he was not utilized whatsoever. Johnson and Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, close advisor, and brother of the president, famously hated each other, dating back to when Bobby was just a Senate lawyer. The Kennedys were well aware of Johnson's political talent and his knack for grabbing power, which may have been one of the reasons they decided to keep him in arm's length. It's November of 1963. John F. Kennedy is dead, Lyndon Johnson is now president, and he decides to address a joint session of Congress. The good old boys from the Southern delegation were all together to witness the triumph of the first Southern president in 100 years. Johnson opens his speech with this incredible line.
All I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today. The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
He then starts talking about John F. Kennedy, what he started, and how important it is to continue. He lists off a few things, then all of a sudden he lays out his top priority.
First, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law.
Let me know in the comment section down below who you think is the most interesting president. I would definitely say LBJ, but I think you knew that already. I also wanted to say thank you because last time I recorded a video, I had 1,500 subscribers and now I have 4,500, which is a pretty massive gap. I could not be happier, and I wanted to thank you guys for subscribing. Thank you to everyone who checks out a video, and I really, really appreciate your support. Like and subscribe, I should probably say that stuff too. Thank you for watching. See you later.